On a rain-soaked March evening in 1991, the highway to St. Helena lay nearly empty. Just one narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the wet, endless fields. The sound of the storm came and went like breathing. At 8:47 p.m., the last county bus pulled out of the terminal with 7 passengers on board. 2 of them were nuns. Sister Margaret Doyle and Sister Evelyn Cross had served at the Mercy House orphanage for nearly a decade. Locals described them as opposites bound by faith. Margaret, the outspoken teacher who scolded latecomers but baked bread for every child. Evelyn, quiet and delicate, a shadow that followed laughter rather than led it. They were heading to the St. Helena convent, a remote sanctuary 2 hours away, where they were to deliver sealed church documents and spend the weekend in retreat. Witnesses later remembered small details. Margaret clutching her rosary as the rain began. Evelyn smiling at the driver when he joked about God's weather. They carried one small suitcase between them, a canvas satchel of parish records, and a folded umbrella that would never be opened again. The bus rolled through the county's low valleys, headlights scattering off puddles. At 9:36 p.m., it stopped at a roadside diner for a 15-minute break. The 2 nuns stepped off, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window. The waitress, a college student named Ruth Carter, told investigators they seemed peaceful, like people going somewhere they'd already been. When the bus horn sounded, Ruth said they left $1 on the counter, smiled, and disappeared into the rain. The driver, Henry Lang, later swore he dropped them near the old St. Helena turnoff. They said a priest would meet them there, he testified. I saw the taillights of a car waiting in the fog. He remembered thinking it strange that the man never stepped out to wave. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sisters Margaret and Evelyn. By dawn, the convent phoned the parish. No one had arrived. The local sheriff's office assumed a breakdown or wrong stop. Officers searched the roadside ditches, the woods, and the narrow bridge over Dry Creek. Nothing. No footprints, no umbrella, not even tire marks from the mysterious car. The next morning, their small canvas bag was found still under a bench at the terminal, its papers untouched. Rumors spread quickly. Some said they'd run away together, burdened by doubts of faith. Others whispered of something darker, an internal dispute within the church, missing funds, forbidden letters. Within a week, reporters from neighboring counties arrived, filming the mist-covered hills where the bus route vanished into silence. Detective Arthur Greaves, newly assigned from the capital, called it a perfect disappearance. The storm had erased every trace. Even the driver's memory seemed to shift each time he told the story. First one headlight in the fog, then 2, then none. Greaves's notepad filled with contradictions and unanswered calls to the convent. Each page, he later said, felt like writing on water. That night, the church held a vigil. Candles flickered under umbrellas. Rain hissed against the flames. Children from the orphanage cried quietly while the priest recited the psalm for the lost. No one dared say what they were all thinking, that faith had met something it could not explain. When dawn broke, the valley looked scrubbed clean, as if the storm had buried the truth beneath the mud. The sheriff closed the road, the bus company filed its report, and St. Helena returned to its rhythm of bells and silence. For 30 years that silence held. Until one morning in the attic of a crumbling parish house, a caretaker opened an old cedar chest marked 1991, Personal Effects. Inside lay a water-damaged journal, its first page signed in fading ink, Sister Evelyn Cross, and beneath it, a single bus ticket, seat 13B. The journal was damp and almost unreadable, its ink smudged by decades of rain and time. But what survived was enough to reopen an old wound. Inside, Sister Evelyn Cross had written about a road that never ends and a promise made to silence. Detective Arthur Greaves turned the fragile pages with gloves, each line echoing a question buried since 1991. He had studied this case before, the unexplained disappearance of 2 nuns after boarding the 8:47 p.m. bus to St. Helena. But now, 30 years later, the rediscovered journal gave him a reason to return. His desk filled with old photographs, the empty highway, the fog-thick valley, the diner where the waitress had served them coffee. Everything was as it had been except for him. Greaves visited the diner first. Ruth Carter, now in her 50s and running the same place, remembered every detail as if it were etched in glass. They were kind, she said. Sister Evelyn gave me a coin with the Virgin Mary on it. Said it was for protection. Funny thing, I still keep it in the register. She handed it to him, a small tarnished medallion. The edge bent slightly as if pressed hard against something. The old waitress hesitated before adding, "There was a man in the corner booth that night. Not one of the regulars. Black coat, collar turned up. He watched them leave. That detail hadn't appeared in the 1991 reports." Greaves's pen stopped mid-note. "Did you tell anyone?" "I did," Ruth said quietly. "The sheriff told me it wasn't important. The detective's next stop was the bus depot. The original driver, Henry Lang, lived 3 towns over, retired and half forgotten. His living room smelled of dust and diesel oil." The old man stared at the detective as though seeing a ghost. "You people never let it rest, do you?" Lang muttered. "They were there 1 minute, gone the next." "I told them a priest picked them up." Greaves nodded. "A priest. You said he was waiting in the fog." Lang frowned. "That's what I thought." "Maybe it wasn't fog. Maybe it was smoke. The lights looked strange that night, like headlights flickering behind trees. I remember slowing down. Then nothing. The road went quiet. Did you ever see him clearly?" Lang hesitated. "No, just the collar. Black and white. That's all I saw before they stepped off the bus." Outside, the wind rattled dry leaves across the asphalt. Greaves looked down the same road, the St. Helena turnoff still unmarked except for a rusted sign half swallowed by weeds. He walked a few paces in, boots sinking in mud where the ditches once flooded. In the silence, he could almost hear the echo of the bus door closing, the rain, the sound of a woman's laugh fading into distance. Back at his car, he opened the evidence bag. Inside, the recovered bus ticket, seat 13B, matched the serial series from 1991. The other half was missing, torn deliberately. The case file had always said 2 passengers, 1 bag, 0 witnesses. But now there was more. A medallion, a missing man in a black coat, a torn ticket. Small pieces, meaningless alone, but together they began to whisper something else. Greaves looked back at the valley and murmured to himself, "They never made it to St. Helena because someone didn't want them to." The next step was clear. The convent's archives still existed, sealed and guarded by a priest who refused every inquiry for 3 decades. If anyone knew what those nuns carried that night, it would be him, and so, as dusk fell over the valley, Detective Greaves drove toward the gates of St. Helena, unaware that behind its stone walls someone had been waiting for this visit all along. The road to St. Helena wound through silent hills, the mist curling around the trees like a warning. Detective Arthur Greaves parked his car before the iron gates of the convent just as the evening bells began to toll. Their echo rolled down, the valley slow and heavy, a sound that seemed less like prayer and more like memory. The convent hadn't changed since 1991. The same stone walls, the same wooden cross leaning slightly with age. Inside, the corridors smelled of beeswax and old paper. A young nun led Greaves toward the parish archives, her footsteps soft against the marble. "Father Thomas will meet you shortly," she whispered. "He doesn't usually speak about them." Father Thomas Hale was in his 70s now, his back bent but his eyes alert. He had been assistant priest during the year of the disappearance, the man who'd first reported the nuns missing. His office was cluttered with ledgers, crucifixes, and an old rotary phone that looked unused for decades. "You're reopening their case?" he asked, voice quiet but sharp. "Trying to," Greaves replied. "We found Sister Evelyn's journal. It mentioned someone who made her promise silence." Father Thomas's hands tightened around his rosary. She wrote things she didn't understand. They were young, devout. But they found something they shouldn't have. "What do you mean?" He looked away. "Records, misplaced documents. The church keeps everything, Detective. Not all of it should be seen." Greaves watched him carefully. "Did you ever see the contents of the bag they carried that night?" Thomas hesitated. "Only briefly. There were receipts, letters, a report about donations that never reached their destination, and the church asked them to deliver these. They volunteered," the priest said softly. "But by the next morning the documents were gone, and so were they." Greaves leaned forward. "Gone or taken?" The priest's silence answered for him. When Greaves stepped back into the hallway, the air felt colder. A door at the far end creaked open. An elderly nun peered out, her face pale under the dim light. "Detective," she whispered. "You're asking about Margaret and Evelyn?" He nodded. Her eyes glistened. They were kind souls. Sister Evelyn had doubts, though. She wrote letters, questions about obedience, about sin. Father Thomas burned most of them after they vanished. Greaves's pulse quickened. He burned her letters? The nun nodded. Said they would hurt the church, but I saw one. She wrote, "Truth doesn't belong to one man." Before he could ask more, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Father Thomas appeared at the corridor's end, his expression unreadable. "That will be all, sister," he said firmly. She lowered her head and retreated into the shadows. Outside, night had settled like dust. The detective stood by the gate, reviewing his notes under the weak beam of his flashlight. Something in the priest's tone lingered, not fear, but guilt. He looked back at the convent windows, where a faint light flickered in the attic. He drove to the local rectory where archived police files were kept. Inside one old box marked 1991 missing persons, he found a letter addressed to the sheriff unsigned, dated weeks after the nuns disappeared. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. They were not lost on the road. The church took care of it. Stop digging before they silence you too. Greaves folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Someone inside the parish had known far more than they'd admitted. The truth wasn't buried in the valley. It was walled inside St. Helena itself. As he stepped into the rain, the church bell tolled again, as if marking time since the night the two nuns vanished. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd return to question Father Thomas again, this time not as a visitor but as an investigator. By autumn of 1993, the rain-soaked fields of St. Helena had returned to silence. The missing nuns case had stretched past 2 years with no witnesses, no bodies, and no new leads. The local police, under quiet pressure from the diocese, marked it inactive. To the town, it was as if Margaret Doyle and Evelyn Cross had simply dissolved into the mist that had swallowed their bus route. Detective Arthur Greaves, reassigned to another division, signed the final report with hesitation. His notes still carried unanswered questions. The burned letters, the missing church funds, the unsigned warning. Yet each time he tried to press further, phone calls from higher offices reminded him that the church had already suffered enough. The official statement released to the public was brief. Due to insufficient evidence and the passage of time, the investigation has been suspended pending new information. The press printed the words once, then moved on. Father Thomas held a memorial service that November. The chapel was full. Parishioners, children from the orphanage, local reporters who came more for closure than truth. Candles lined the altar, their smoke curling toward the ceiling like ghosts refusing to rise. Greaves stood in the back pew, watching the priest's trembling hands as he read the final prayer. "The Lord receives those lost to darkness," Thomas said, voice breaking slightly, "and forgives those who could not save them." Margaret's brother Daniel Doyle sat in the front row. His face looked older than his 34 years, drawn and hollow from months of searching. He had combed the woods, the bus route, even the shallow creeks himself. Once he'd driven all the way to the diocese office in the city, demanding to see the records the sisters were meant to deliver. They told him those files never existed. After the service, he approached Greaves outside beneath the drizzle. "You're giving up too?" Daniel asked. Greaves looked down. "There's nothing left to hold on to." Daniel shook his head. "That's what they want you to think." Weeks later, Daniel posted missing person flyers again, stapling them to telephone poles already weathered by rain. Few stopped to read them anymore. For the people of St. Helena, grief had turned into fatigue, the kind that made silence easier than hope. By winter, the convent replaced the missing sisters with new novices. Their rooms were repainted, their names erased from the prayer boards. Even the old bus driver, Henry Lang, sold his house and left town, saying he wanted to forget the sound of that road. Yet not everyone moved on. A groundskeeper clearing the roadside weeds near Dry Creek Bridge found a small object half buried in the soil, a rusted cross necklace, bent at the center. He turned it over to the parish, where it was quietly locked away in a drawer. The sheriff's department noted it in the archives as non-conclusive. Years rolled forward, and St. Helena's story faded into the quiet footnotes of unsolved cases. The convent grew older. Father Thomas retired to a small parish on the coast. Daniel left town, carrying his sister's memory like a wound that never healed. But in 2021, 30 years after the disappearance, a priest in another city would make a confession on his deathbed, one that would pull the entire case from its grave. 30 years had passed since sisters Margaret Doyle and Evelyn Cross vanished into the rain. Time had turned their names into whispers, old headlines fading in yellowed files, parish records collecting dust. St. Helena had changed. The convent was now a retreat center, the orphanage converted into a museum of religious history, but some silences, even decades deep, never truly settle. In 2021, a hospice nurse named Mara Linton worked the night shift at St. Bartholomew's Care Home, a coastal facility for retired clergy. One of her patients, Father Andrew Cole, had been transferred there 2 months earlier, frail, soft-spoken, and restless in his sleep. His medical file listed nothing unusual: mild dementia, heart failure, and a lifetime of service. What it didn't mention was that he had once served at St. Helena in the spring of 1991. It began with murmurs. Late one night, Mara heard him whisper names in his sleep. Margaret, Evelyn, followed by a choked plea for forgiveness. The next night, the same. Finally, she asked him gently, "Father, who are they?" He stared past her with clouded eyes. 2 sisters who didn't deserve what came to them. At first, Mara thought it was just a dreamer's ramble. But a few days later, Father Andrew grew agitated during morning prayers. "They were faithful," he said suddenly to no one in particular. "They trusted the church to protect them, but I buried what I couldn't live with." The words froze the room. Mara began recording his confessions on her phone, unsure whether she was hearing delusion or history resurfacing. Over several nights, fragments of a story emerged. The nuns discovering something hidden in the donations ledger, a transfer order that was never approved, and a night when men came in silence, not in faith. By the 4th recording, his voice broke into sobs. "I heard them crying in the van. I was told to keep quiet. They said it was mercy, that the church would handle it." Mara, shaken, searched the internet for the names he had spoken. Within minutes, the screen filled with old clippings. 2 nuns missing since 1991. St. Helena case goes cold. The next morning, she reached out to local authorities, forwarding the audio. The file eventually reached Detective Arthur Greaves, now long retired but still occasionally assisting on cold cases. When he played the recordings, his hands trembled. The same names, the same silence, revived after 3 decades. Greaves drove to St. Bartholomew's himself, carrying a worn leather folder stamped St. Helena, 1991. He found Father Andrew sitting by the window, sunlight pooling across his frail hands. "You remember me, Father?" Greaves asked softly. The old man's eyes flickered with faint recognition. "The investigator," he whispered. "You were too early back then. The truth was still buried." "What truth?" Greaves pressed. Father Andrew turned toward him slowly, tears gathering. "There were 2 of them. They found records they shouldn't have. I was told to make sure those papers never reached the bishop's desk." His breathing quickened. "But they took it too far. I wanted to stop it, but by the time I tried, it was already done." Greaves leaned forward. "What was done, Father?" The priest's lips trembled. "They were buried. Near the orchard. Behind the old parish house. God forgive us." Moments later, alarms sounded. Father Andrew collapsed, clutching his chest. Doctors rushed in, but his pulse faded before he could finish the sentence. Greaves stood by the bed, the words "behind the old parish house" echoing like a bell in his mind. The next day, he reopened the case file, officially this time, and prepared to return to St. Helena. 30 years after the storm, the valley was about to give up what it had buried. The morning after Father Andrew's death, the air around St. Helena felt unnaturally still, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Detective Arthur Greaves returned to the town that had haunted him for half his career. The church steeple looked smaller now, the paint peeled and the windows clouded with dust. Yet the silence felt exactly as it had 30 years earlier, the same faint hum of wind through the pines, the same unanswered questions hiding beneath the surface. He met Mara Linton at the parish gate. She had driven down herself, bringing copies of the audio recordings and a folder of medical notes. He kept saying he buried the truth, she told Greaves. I don't think he meant it as a metaphor. Greaves nodded. Then we start where his words end, behind the old parish house. The parish caretaker, an old man named Jonas Meyer, let them inside the crumbling residence that once housed priests and visiting clergy. The smell of damp wood and candle wax hung heavy in the air. Dust motes drifted through narrow beams of light, stirring with every cautious step. The floorboards creaked as if whispering secrets. They began in the cellar but found nothing. Only old hymnals, broken furniture, and a faint trace of mold. It wasn't until Jonas mentioned the attic that Greaves felt the pulse of curiosity sharpen. No one's been up there since the 90s, the caretaker muttered. Leaky roof made it dangerous. The staircase was narrow, the wood soft under their weight. At the top, sunlight cut through a hole in the roof, casting a pale glow across stacks of boxes and forgotten relics. Candle holders, baptism records, portraits of priests long dead. In the corner sat an old cedar chest covered by a moth-eaten cloth. Its brass latch had corroded green, but Greaves pried it open carefully. Inside lay a collection of small personal effects, rosary beads, a cracked mirror, and beneath them a leather-bound journal sealed in wax. The cover was faintly embossed with initials, E.C. Sister Evelyn Cross. Mara's breath caught. He said something about confession, she whispered. Greaves opened the journal slowly, the pages brittle but legible. The first entry was dated March 2nd, 1991, 3 days before the disappearance. Margaret insists we deliver the reports ourselves. Father Andrew says the bishop mustn't be disturbed. Something feels wrong. I saw men loading crates near the chapel, marked with the orphanage's name but bound for somewhere else. Greaves turned the pages carefully, each line revealing more unease. Evelyn wrote of late-night meetings between clergy, locked drawers, and whispered orders. Margaret fears the money meant for the children is gone. I told her to let it go. She said faith means nothing if it hides sin. The later entries grew shorter, frantic, her handwriting trembling across the paper. We were told to leave tonight. Father Andrew said he'd drive us halfway and that the church would take care of the rest. But why does he look so afraid? Then the final written page ended abruptly mid-sentence. He said God will forgive. The rest of the line was torn cleanly away. Greaves stared at the empty space. The paper fibers along the tear were fresh compared to the rest, as though someone had ripped it long after the original writing. Mara scanned the attic around them. Someone came back for this, she said quietly. Greaves nodded. And they didn't want that last sentence to exist. He photographed each page and sealed the journal into an evidence bag. The air in the attic seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in from all sides. Somewhere outside, the church bell struck noon. 1, 2, 3, a hollow echo through the valley. As they descended the stairs, Jonas stopped them. There's something else, he said uneasily. Years ago, a box of tapes was taken from that same attic. The diocese ordered them destroyed. I never saw what was on them. Greaves paused mid-step. Tapes? Cassette interviews, Jonas said. Old parish records, maybe confessions. I remember one label. Bus route, Lang H. Greaves exchanged a glance with Mara, the missing driver. The night of the storm. The journal had given them fear in ink. Now somewhere a voice might exist. One that had witnessed everything. He closed the evidence bag and looked toward the church. If those tapes still exist, he said, they'll tell us what the ink can't. Rain slicked the narrow streets of St. Helena that evening, the kind that made every window reflect its own ghost. Detective Greaves sat in his car outside the church, the journal on the seat beside him, its damp leather cover breathing faintly under the windshield's trembling light. He had gone over Sister Evelyn's entries again and again, but every line seemed to point not just toward fear, but toward something recorded, something meant to outlast confession. Across the street, Mara Linton arrived with a cardboard box she'd borrowed from the parish archives. The storm had caught her halfway there. Her coat was soaked, her hair clinging to her face. I found something in the inventory, she said, sliding into the passenger seat. There's a list from 1992. Orphanage outreach interviews, 5 tapes total. but only 4 were returned to the diocese. Greaves looked at her. And the missing one? She held up the faded paper. Tape 3, label, bus route, Lang H, just like Jonas said. They both fell silent. The name had surfaced before. Harold Lang, the man who drove the parish bus that last night in March 1991. He vanished the same week as the nuns. Officially, he had been ruled a runaway, though no one had ever found his remains. Greaves exhaled slowly. If that tape survived, it might be the only voice left from that night. They decided to start with Jonas Meyer again. The caretaker lived in a small cottage behind the rectory, surrounded by stacks of rusted tools and forgotten church records. When he opened the door, his expression carried both recognition and reluctance. I told you everything I know, Jonas said, rubbing his hands together. Maybe not everything, Greaves replied calmly. You mentioned those tapes once before, that the diocese ordered them destroyed. Jonas hesitated. Yes, but not all of them went. One was missing when they came to collect the box. Father Andrew was furious. Said it contained something not meant for the living. Mara stepped closer. Do you know where it went? Jonas looked over her shoulder toward the dark church, as if listening for something unseen. Father Andrew told me to say nothing, but after he died, I started wondering whether silence ever saved anyone. He turned and shuffled toward a back room. The minutes stretched like wire. Finally, Jonas emerged with a small tin case wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table carefully, as if it might detonate. I kept this hidden, he murmured. Didn't know if it was right or wrong. Inside lay a single dust-caked cassette. Its white label had nearly faded, but the faint handwriting was still legible. Bus route, Lang. H. Mara's breath hitched. Greaves leaned in, inspecting it closely. The magnetic tape visible through the window wound tight and fragile. You realize this could be evidence, he said. Jonas nodded. Then let it speak before someone buries it again. They brought the cassette to Mara's car, where she'd set up a small portable player used for interviews. Greaves slipped the tape in carefully, pressing the play button with his thumb. At first, only static, a hiss of age and neglect. Then faintly a voice. Male. Nervous. The quality was poor, but the fear in the tone was unmistakable. This is Harold Lang, March 4th, 1991. I'm doing what they asked, the drive to St. Helena Convent. 2 passengers, the sisters. They think it's routine, but the route's been changed. Father Andrew said there was flooding on the main road, but it's not flooding. It's something else. The tape clicked, then continued. We stopped near the quarry. There were lights. Men waiting, not churchmen. They said the sisters were being relocated. One of them cried. Margaret, I think. They put something in the back of the truck. Boxes. Crates. I don't know what was in them. Greaves felt his stomach tighten. Mara's hand hovered near the volume dial, afraid to interrupt. Then came the final line before the recording cut off abruptly. If I don't make it back, tell them it wasn't the storm. It was the order. The player stopped with a faint click, the silence that followed heavier than the rain outside. Mara whispered. He knew. Greaves nodded slowly. And he recorded it knowing he wouldn't live to explain it. The old tape had answered one question only to open 5 more. What order had Lang referred to? And why would the church have men waiting at the quarry in the middle of a storm? As thunder rolled across the valley, Greaves rewound the cassette and sealed it in an evidence bag beside Evelyn's journal. We're not dealing with disappearances, he said quietly. We're dealing with a cover-up. Mara looked at him. So what now? Greaves started the engine, the car headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Now, he said, we find the quarry. The rain had stopped by dawn, but St. Helena looked washed of all color. Pale streets, silver mist, and the faint echo of church bells drifting through the valley. Detective Greaves hadn't slept. The tape still replayed in his mind, each word of Harold Lang's trembling voice burning deeper with every repetition. It wasn't the storm. It was the order. That sentence had changed everything. If Lang's recording was real, then the disappearance of the 2 nuns wasn't an accident. It was a silenced operation, hidden beneath the church's authority. Mara Linton arrived at the precinct carrying 2 cups of bitter coffee and a new sense of determination. Her hair was still damp, her expression sharper than the night before. I checked the diocese archives again, she said. There's something off. The parish ledgers from 1991, the month the sisters vanished, are missing 3 pages. They were replaced with carbon copies dated 1993. Someone doctored the records. Greaves leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Who handled the archiving back then? Father Andrew, she said quietly. And a man named Bishop Raymond Kerr. He oversaw all clerical property in the region. Retired in 2001, still lives up north. Greaves scribbled the name down. If those pages were replaced, there must be an original file somewhere. Mara nodded. And I think I know where. They drove to the old rectory again, this time to the back office, a room Father Andrew had rarely let anyone enter. Dust coated everything. The crucifix above the desk, the cracked lamp, the locked filing cabinet still stamped with the church seal. Greaves took a metal rod and pried the top drawer open. Inside were decades of correspondence. Receipts, donation lists, invoices. Nothing unusual at first glance. But behind one stack of papers, his hand brushed against something solid. A false wooden panel. He eased it loose. Hidden behind it was a thin manila folder, its edges warped by moisture and time. Across the front was a handwritten label, St. Helena Outreach or Confidential, for Kerr only. Greaves laid the folder on the desk, heart pounding. Inside were photocopied documents, some stamped restricted, others redacted entirely. One page, however, was untouched, a typed report signed by Bishop Kerr himself. Shipment records and relocation details of St. Helena property. 2 clergy members reassigned to diocesan care following the March incident. Property sealed and monitored under instruction. Maintain discretion. Mara frowned. Relocation of property? Not persons? Greaves nodded grimly. It's coded. They weren't reassigned. They were removed. Further inside the file was a photograph, black and white, dated the same week the sisters vanished. It showed 3 men standing near a truck on a muddy road. The faint silhouette of a cross marked the side of the vehicle, and behind them the jagged outline of a quarry wall. Harold Lang's last words echoed in Greaves's head. They put something in the back of the truck. Boxes, crates. But this photo suggested there had been more than boxes. A faint smear in the corner looked human, the shape of a hand pressed against glass. Mara stared, her voice trembling. That's the quarry. The same one from Lang's tape. Greaves carefully turned to the last sheet in the folder. A single-page memo dated April 1991. Project Helena has been secured. Subjects declared deceased under natural causes. Documentation to remain sealed. Destroy recording evidence immediately. The words chilled them both. Mara whispered, Project Helena? It sounds like an operation name. Greaves folded the paper, or a cover name for what they did here. He placed the documents into an evidence envelope and sealed it shut. This isn't just about 2 missing nuns anymore. It's systemic. Someone ordered their silence and made sure the paper trail vanished. They locked the office behind them as daylight faded through the broken blinds. Outside, the mist had begun to thin, revealing the distant ridgeline beyond the town, where the old quarry lay hidden behind trees and forgotten fences. Greaves paused at the doorway, his eyes on the horizon. If those files survived 30 years, he said, maybe something else did too. Mara followed his gaze. You think the quarry still holds evidence? He gave a slight nod. Bodies don't vanish. People make them vanish. But the ground remembers. The wind carried the faint toll of a church bell again. Slow, mournful, like a warning. Greaves tucked the file beneath his arm and started toward the car. Next stop, he said, the quarry. The drive to the northern ridge was long and silent, the road snaking through fog like a half-forgotten memory. Detective Greaves gripped the steering wheel as the headlights cut through the mist, revealing the faint sign for Helena Quarry, closed since 1992. They had spent the morning verifying the file's contents, false ledgers, coded memos, and the chilling reference to Project Helena. But before heading to the quarry, Mara had insisted on one detour. Before we go digging, she'd said, we need to talk to someone who knew the sisters before they disappeared. Someone who never believed the church's version. Now they stood before a small cabin on the edge of Cedar Hollow, its roof sagging under decades of moss. Smoke rose weakly from a chimney. A single figure sat on the porch, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and haunted eyes. Thomas Cross, Greaves said quietly. Evelyn's brother. Thomas looked up slowly, suspicion clouding his face. Your police? Former, Greaves replied. Cold Case Division. We're reopening the investigation into your sister's disappearance. The man's hands trembled as he set down his mug. That's 30 years too late, Detective. Mara stepped forward gently. Mr. Cross, we found your sister's journal. She wrote about fear, about something happening inside the parish before she vanished. Thomas's eyes sharpened. You found it? His tone carried both disbelief and grief. They told me it was destroyed, along with everything else she left behind. Greaves nodded. It survived. And so did a tape from the bus driver that night. For the first time, Thomas went still. Lang, you have his voice? Yes, Greaves said. He mentioned a route change, men at the quarry, and a cover-up ordered by the church. Thomas turned away, his shoulders tense. Then you're already closer than anyone's ever been. He motioned for them to come inside. The cabin smelled of pine and tobacco, its walls lined with yellowed photographs and old newspaper clippings. A framed photo sat on the mantel, a young nun smiling beside another, both in simple habits, sunlight washing their faces. That's her, Thomas murmured, tracing the edge of the glass. Evelyn and Margaret. They weren't just nuns, and they were truth-tellers. They started looking into where the church's donations were really going. Evelyn called me the week before she disappeared. Said she found something in the accounting books that could end a career. Greaves exchanged a glance with Mara. Bishop Kerr? Thomas nodded grimly. That's my guess. She told me if anything happened, I'd find answers in a sealed file marked Helena Outreach. I searched for years, but the parish shut me out. They said I was defiling holy ground. Mara unzipped the evidence folder and laid the recovered file on the table. She wasn't wrong. The bishop signed off on their removal. There's even a line calling them subjects. Thomas's face crumpled, fury and sorrow fighting for space. They reduced them to property, he said under his breath. Greaves spoke carefully. Do you know anything about the quarry? Why the church might have used it? Thomas looked toward the window, his reflection barely visible in the fog. The quarry was once church-owned. They used it to store materials for the orphanage, or so they said. But there were rumors. Trucks arriving late at night, lights in the pit, no records of what was delivered. He paused, lowering his voice. 2 weeks after my sister vanished, a worker from the quarry came to me drunk. Said he'd seen men burying something heavy wrapped in cloth near the drainage trench. He was gone by morning. His house burned down. The air in the cabin thickened. Greaves felt the pulse of adrenaline, the kind that comes when a theory becomes something more tangible. Mr. Cross, Mara said gently, would you be willing to show us where that trench was? Thomas's eyes lifted to hers, weary but resolute. I swore I'd never go back there. But if it means bringing her home... He stood, grabbing his coat from the chair. I'll take you. He paused at the door, glancing back at the old photograph on the mantel. They built their church on silence, he said softly. Maybe it's time the ground speaks instead. Outside, the fog had thickened again, rolling across the valley like a veil. The three of them walked toward the waiting car, the air filled with the low hum of wind through the trees. As Greaves started the engine, Mara looked at him. If the story he told is true, there might still be evidence buried there. Physical remains. Greaves tightened his grip on the wheel. And maybe, he said, the reason the church wanted the case buried too. The headlights flared, cutting through the mist as the car turned toward the distant hills. Behind them, the church bell tolled once, a sound that seemed less like a call to prayer and more like a warning. The road to the quarry cut through a stretch of forest that seemed untouched by time. The trees leaned inward like spectators, their branches heavy with rain. The car's headlights traced the narrow dirt path, and in the back seat Thomas Cross sat silently, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. They had reached the place where Evelyn's trail had ended, and where the truth, it seemed, had been buried ever since. Greaves parked near the rusted no trespassing sign, the engine's hum dying into the stillness of the valley. Mist rose from the ground, curling over piles of stone and debris. This is it, Thomas said quietly. The drainage trench was near the lower pit. But the ground's probably shifted after all these years. They walked down the slope, flashlights slicing through the fog. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. Greaves's boots crunched against gravel until he stopped. Something metallic caught the light near the base of a collapsed fence. A half-buried cross, small and crude, hammered into the dirt. Thomas stared at it, the muscles in his jaw tightening. That wasn't here before. Greaves crouched, brushing soil away. The cross was fashioned from 2 pieces of welded rebar. The base sunk deep into compacted mud. No name, no date, just silence. Before he could say anything, the beam of Mara's flashlight landed on something else. A fragment of wood, then fabric. It took only a few minutes of digging before the outline of a weathered crate appeared beneath the dirt. Greaves pried it open, the hinges screeching like metal on bone. Inside lay several sealed envelopes stamped with the insignia of the Diocese of Helena. Each one bore the same red stamp. Confidential Internal Investigation. Mara carefully pulled out one envelope and unfolded its contents. Her voice trembled as she read aloud, Statement Father Andrew Calloway. April 1991. Thomas's breath caught. Andrew, the same man who brought them to the bus. Greaves nodded. Let's hear what he had to say. The statement, typed and signed, was brief but devastating. I was instructed by Bishop Kerr to transport Sisters Evelyn Cross and Margaret Dwyer under the pretense of reassignment. The true purpose was to remove them from parish duties after they discovered discrepancies in the financial ledgers. They were to be delivered to the quarry for further transfer. I was told no harm would come to them. Mara's voice faltered as she continued. Upon arrival, I found 2 men already waiting. They were not clergy. When I questioned their presence, I was told to leave. One of the sisters screamed my name. I hesitated, and Kerr himself called me the next morning, instructing me to burn all related records. The page ended there. Silence filled the quarry, broken only by the soft patter of rain on metal. Thomas's face had gone pale. He knew, he whispered. Father Andrew knew they were never coming back. Greaves folded the paper, his jaw tight, and he carried that guilt for 30 years. His final confession, that was his way of unburdening it. Mara crouched beside the crate, pulling out the remaining envelopes. Each contained correspondence, letters between diocesan officials, invoices for relocation expenses, and one chilling note written in a trembling hand. They begged for mercy. I told them the Lord would forgive, but I cannot. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, A. Calloway. Thomas sank to his knees, the weight of 30 years collapsing into a single moment. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and iron. He was her priest, he murmured. She trusted him. Greaves placed a hand on his shoulder. He tried to protect them, and failed. That failure broke him. Mara looked toward the fog curling above the pit. So Father Andrew wasn't the villain. He was the witness, Greaves nodded, and Bishop Kerr was the architect. He sealed the documents into a new evidence bag. This is the truth Father Andrew couldn't say out loud, he said quietly. His final act was leaving us a trail back here. Thomas rose slowly, his face streaked with rain. Then we finished what he couldn't. Greaves turned toward the horizon where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to break. We will. But to do that, we need to confront Kerr, before someone else erases him too. The mist thickened again, rolling across the quarry like the closing of a curtain. The truth had finally surfaced, but the man who ordered it all was still alive. The morning after the quarry revelation, St. Helena seemed to breathe differently, as if the fog itself had thinned to make way for what was coming. The evidence from the pit now sat sealed inside the precinct's vault. Father Andrew's signed confession, the diocesan letters, and the box that had slept beneath the earth for 3 decades. Detective Greaves barely slept. The words of the confession looped in his head like a psalm turned rotten. They begged for mercy. I told them the Lord would forgive, but I cannot. By dawn, Mara had already traced Bishop Kerr's retirement home to a coastal town 3 hours north. But before leaving, Thomas Cross had one request. Before we chase another ghost, he said, his voice raw, I need to show you something. Something I never told anyone. Greaves hesitated. You think it's connected? Thomas looked away. I think it's where the truth began. The drive led them west through winding hills that opened into a quiet stretch of farmland. The road ended at an abandoned orchard. Rows of apple trees withered and brittle, their fruit long gone. The sign at the gate had faded to a whisper of letters. St. Helena Children's Home, established 1968. Mara frowned. The orphanage? Thomas nodded. Evelyn used to teach the children here on weekends, before everything went wrong. They walked through the overgrown path, branches brushing against their coats, the air thick with decay and memory. Beyond the trees stood a crumbling cottage, once the caretaker's quarters, now half swallowed by ivy. Thomas stopped at its edge, his hands trembling. "She brought me here once," he said quietly, "a few weeks before she vanished. Said she'd found something buried behind the orchard. I thought she meant papers, maybe money. I told her not to dig. She said, 'Tom, if I don't, no one ever will.'" Greaves felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Do you remember where?" Thomas pointed toward a patch of uneven soil near the last row of trees. The grass there was strangely sparse, the earth darker, looser. Greaves and Mara began to dig, careful, deliberate. After only a few inches, the shovel struck something solid. A wooden edge. They cleared away the dirt until a small, rotted box appeared, roughly the size of a shoebox, bound with rusted wire. Mara knelt, prying it open with her pocket knife. Inside were several items preserved remarkably well. A rosary, a cracked photograph, and a bundle of folded papers tied with twine. Thomas leaned closer, his breath catching. "That's her handwriting." Mara carefully unfolded the first page. The ink had faded, but the words were still readable. "March 1st, 1991, the children are gone. They said they were transferred to a sister orphanage, but the records don't match. There are fewer names each week. Father Andrew looks sick. Margaret says we must tell someone, but I fear we're being watched." Greaves flipped through more pages. The entries grew shorter, panicked. "They came again tonight. Took 3. Said it was for medical examination. I saw the truck leave through the orchard gate. No one will listen, then the final entry. If they find this, tell Thomas to forgive me. The truth is buried here, not in stone, but in the faces they forgot." Mara's hands shook. "She wasn't just uncovering corruption," she whispered. "She was uncovering disappearances." Greaves stared at the small photograph that had fallen from the box. A group of children smiling in front of the chapel, with a man standing behind them. His clerical collar was unmistakable. "Bishop Kerr," Greaves said flatly. Thomas's voice broke. She knew. She found out what they were doing to those kids. The orchard was silent, save for the low hum of wind through the dying branches. Greaves sealed the documents into a new evidence bag. If this journal is real, Kerr didn't just cover up a disappearance. He orchestrated it. Thomas stared at the trees, his grief hardening into quiet fury. "And he buried them beneath his orchard." Mara looked at Greaves, her voice low. "If she wrote about missing children, there could be graves here. Real ones." Greaves nodded grimly. "We'll bring a team. Ground scans, forensic dig. If there's anything left to find, this place will tell us." As they turned back toward the car, the wind stirred again, carrying the faint scent of apples long rotted away. The orchard creaked softly, like it was remembering. Thomas stopped once more at the edge of the trees. "She used to say the church was built on faith," he murmured. "But this one was built on bones." Greaves looked toward the horizon where the sun bled through the fog. "Then let's dig until we find every one of them." The wind fell silent again, as if the ground was waiting. The orchard excavation began 2 days later under a sky the color of old parchment. Forensic tents dotted the once-forgotten field, their white canopies trembling in the cold wind. The scent of freshly turned soil clung to everything. The air, the gloves, the quiet breaths of those who had come to unearth the truth. Detective Greaves stood at the edge of the dig site, hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the ground team move with precision. Each shovelful of earth was history being exhumed, guilt being uncovered. Thomas Cross stood a few yards away, silent, eyes fixed on the orchard's far corner where the apple trees bent inward like mourners. By mid-afternoon, one of the officers shouted, "Sir, we've got something." Mara hurried over. The team had uncovered what looked like a section of cloth, faded gray, stiff with age. Beneath it, the outline of small bones began to emerge. The orchard, it seemed, was no longer just a metaphor. Greaves felt a wave of cold rise from his chest. "How many?" The forensic lead swallowed hard. "At least 4. But there could be more and deeper down." Thomas turned away, pressing a trembling hand to his mouth. "She was right," he whispered. She knew this was here. Mara unfolded her tablet, scrolling through Evelyn's journal scans. "In her last entry, she mentioned a truck leaving the orchard gate," she murmured. "If those trucks were moving the children, this place was just one stop." Greaves looked toward the collapsing cottage in the distance. Then maybe the next stop still exists. They moved inside the cottage, its air thick with mildew and rot. The walls were papered with water stains, and a crucifix hung crookedly above the doorway. In one corner, beneath a pile of warped floorboards, Mara found a rusted metal box. She pried it open to reveal a single reel-to-reel tape labeled in faint blue ink, Orchard Confession, 1992. Greaves exhaled slowly. Another tape. They carried it back to the precinct that night. The power flickered as the old player spun, releasing a faint hiss of static. Then a man's voice came through, wavering, hoarse, almost desperate. "This is Father Andrew Kell. If anyone finds this, I am not seeking forgiveness and only record." The bishop ordered the removals, said they were sick, that the children needed treatment away from public eyes. But there was no treatment, only graves. The orchard was his design, not mine. I buried what I was told to bury. God help me. Thomas's hand tightened around the edge of the table. He recorded this before he died. Mara nodded. It's dated early '92, right before the diocese declared him unfit for service. Greaves's jaw clenched. And Kerr retired 2 months later. Convenient timing. The room fell silent except for the low hum of the tape. Then faintly another voice could be heard on the recording. Not Father Andrew's. A deeper tone, steady and cold. "If you speak of this again, Andrew, you'll join them in the ground." The tape clicked off. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mara whispered, "That voice. It matches the one on the missing tape recovered from the rectory." Greaves nodded. "Bishop Kerr." Thomas sank back in his chair, staring at the floor. He silenced everyone. "The children, the nuns, even Andrew." His voice cracked. "And my sister." Greaves leaned forward. "If this confession exists, there's proof of systematic abuse and cover-up. The orchard isn't just a burial ground. It's evidence of mass concealment." "But the bishop's dead," Mara reminded him quietly. "Who do we hold accountable now?" Greaves looked toward the wall of case files. Names, faces, unsolved fragments. "We start with what's left behind. His records, his estate, anyone who helped him." Mara opened her laptop, typing quickly. The diocese archives were sealed after Kerr's death. But his private secretary, Father Latham, he's still alive. Lives in a nursing home near the coast. Thomas looked up, eyes burning with quiet resolve. "Then that's where we go next." No more silence. Outside, thunder rolled low across the horizon, distant yet deliberate, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment. Greaves switched off the tape recorder. The church kept its secrets buried for 30 years, but now the ground itself is speaking. Mara closed her notebook, "And we're going to make sure everyone hears." The rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window, like echoes returning from the orchard. Greaves turned toward the door, his voice low but certain. "Let's find the man who guarded the bishop's sins.